Students, welcome to Chapter 6, Learners with Learning Disabilities. The first chapter that we discussed this semester had to do with orientating you to the idea of learning disabilities, or to the field of learning disabilities. We talked about the difference between disability and a handicap. We talked about the importance of being able to focus on the strengths of students. I introduced you to some various terms in Chapter 1, and we talked about the trends that were occurring in the area of exceptional learners, such as inclusion, deinstitutionalization, etc. In Chapter 2, we took a deeper look into exceptional learners, and we talked about the steps that would be followed if a student qualified for exceptional learner services. We talked about the importance of RTI and how that is put in place to make sure that those students who are receiving services in exceptional learners do in fact need those services. We talked about the IEP and the components of IEPs, and then we also talked about some of the challenges that are occurring in the field because of No Child Left Behind and some of the accountability initiatives that are taking place now. So those two chapters, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, really kind of provide the foundation for your understanding of the field. Now we're going to move in the remaining chapters. We're going to move into some specific disabilities. And this disability, learning disabilities, is the most prominent category for learning disabilities. Over 50% of the students that are in exceptional learners have a learning disability. Usually it's in either reading or math. So let's go start with our language of the field, our vocabulary. And the first term I want to introduce to you is functional behavior assessment. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about learning disabilities, when we talk about disabilities as a whole, not just learning disabilities, that disabilities can be academic or they can also be behavior. So when we're talking about behavior-related disabilities, functional behavior assessment is a way to determine what types of disability is occurring in the area of behavior. So those three arrows at the bottom of that slide, a functional behavior assessment would be an assessment that we would use on a student that has behavior problems. And the purpose of that would be, number one, to determine what is the context for misbehavior. When does it occur? Does it occur in the morning? Does it occur before lunch, after lunch? Does it occur before going home? Or is it random? Okay. The second question that we would ask in a functional behavior assessment is what triggers that behavior? What causes that misbehavior to occur? Once we can identify the trigger, then oftentimes we can work to address the behavior. And then number three, just like in academic arena, just like in the academic arena, there are interventions that we can use to address behavior. So in this chapter, we're not necessarily going to be talking a lot about behavior. We will be doing that in the next couple chapters, but I wanted to introduce this term to you so that you're familiar with it. Again, functional behavior assessment is just an assessment that we use to identify the context of misbehavior, what triggers the misbehavior, and what are interventions we can use to address behavior. Common Core standards, I think you're pretty familiar with these. These are the standards that are used in Georgia to identify what students need to know and be able to do. And if you click on the link, it will take you right to the website. And I would encourage you just to take a few minutes and maybe pick the grade level or the level that you're most interested in and look at some of the standards that occur in that level. See how the standards are constructed and how they look on the website. A gifted student, again, we won't be talking a whole lot this chapter about gifted student, but I want to introduce you to the term gifted. Many of you probably were in middle school or high school programs, maybe even elementary programs where you had a gifted student program. Gifted students fall in the realm of exceptional learners because most states and districts receive additional money for students that are gifted. And this slide identifies or categorizes what we mean by gifted students. They have a high degree of intellectual creative ability, and that's usually measured on some type of assessment. Sometimes it's an IQ assessment or an achievement assessment or a combination of both. These are students that exhibit high motivation, although there are times when gifted students may not exhibit high motivation, or they excel in an academic field. And the idea of gifted education is that these students need special instruction to achieve at levels that are commensurate with their abilities. So just as we take students that might be at risk, we want to adjust the instruction to meet their needs. We also have students at the upper end of the spectrum who need accommodations, modifications, adjustment so that they are working at their ability. There are many different ways in which services can be delivered for gifted students. We can use enrichment, in other words, having them do projects and things that really challenge them at their grade level, or sometimes districts accelerate the student. They'll put him or her in a grade above where they currently are. Okay, so I wanted to familiarize yourself with that student, or with that term, gifted student. There is a chapter in our text on giftedness, but we will not be covering that this semester. When we talk about learning disabilities, we're usually talking about issues or problems in neurology, problems with the brain, all right? And many of the problems in learning disabilities stem from the left temporal lobe. And problems can be structural, in other words, they can be related to the size of various areas of the brain, or they can be related to functional differences, in other words, certain activities in the brain. If we think of the brain as lots of wires that are all connected, sometimes those connections aren't strong, or they may be weak, or they may even be broken. So that those connections or lack of connections can relate to the functional differences of the brain. Now you'll see a little link there on this slide, and I would encourage you to watch. There's 2 videos here. I would encourage you to watch these. They're not very long, but they'll give you some good background in terms of the relationship between the brain and learning disabilities. Another area of concern when we're talking about learning disabilities is toxins that cause malformations of the fetus. These are usually things that are done prenatal, before birth. Could be drinking, could be drugs, it could be the environment, sometimes the paint on the walls, sometimes the furniture, anything that kind of exhibits a toxin can potentially cause problems for the fetus. Smoking would be another area that would be a concern. And oftentimes we find, when we trace back and we look at what the causes are for learning disabilities, we can sometimes trace them back to toxins. So when we talk about learning disabilities, we're talking about problems in academic achievement, whether it be reading or math. When we talk about reading area, and you'll have this in other classes, but there are 4 areas, actually more than 4, but this slide has 4 areas where there can be problems. The first one is decoding, the ability to convert print to spoken language. You can very easily read words, and you can translate word sounds into word meaning, but students that have difficulty in reading cannot do that. Phonological awareness is the ability to hear sounds, and this is one of the first areas in which students are tested as far back as kindergarten or sometimes in pre-kindergarten. If they aren't able to hear the sounds, if they've had tubes put in their ears, or if they've had hearing problems when they were very, very young, if they can't hear a particular sound like p, 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 or ch, 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 if they can't hear that and translate it, then there's a really good sign that they're going to have reading problems. So this is, phonological awareness is really kind of the early warning sign that reading problems will occur. Phonemic awareness has to do with recognizing the fact that letters, when they're put together, make sounds. For example, bat is made up of b, a, t. Now that's very simple for you and I to be able to figure that out, but some students can look at b, at, and you ask them to say that and they're not able to put those three letters together. So they have problems in phonemic awareness. And that's usually the second, usually phonological awareness is the early warning sign, and then phonemic awareness kind of confirms that there's reading issues. Phonics, ability to know and match letters to sounds, is also an area. So a student that has trouble in any of these areas, especially when they're beginning with phonological awareness, could potentially be a sign that there are reading issues or reading problems. So memory, when we're learning, memory becomes a really important part of being able to learn, to be able to remember and recall information. Students that have disabilities oftentimes have much trouble with short-term memory. In other words, you teach them something and within a few minutes they have forgotten it. They also have difficulty with long-term as well. Teach something, not only do they not recall it in short-term, but they are not able to store it in the brain in a way they can easily access it. So when we talk about memory and learning disabilities, there's a strong correlation between the two. We've talked about short-term, long-term memory. Working memory is keeping information in mind while you're simultaneously doing another cognitive task. So writing directions by listening would be a way that you would use working memory. So if you are listening to this and you are also taking notes and you're also watching the PowerPoint, you are doing three things simultaneously. Students who have disabilities would not, or severe disabilities, would be unable to do those three things. They may even have difficulty doing two things. They may have difficulty listening to my voice and then writing down the information. They may only be able to listen to what I have to say. And if they have problems in short-term memory, then what I'm saying, unless there's a way that I can help them capture that information in a meaningful way, there's a good chance that they will forget it. Now, metacognition is a kind of a fancy word, but is knowing that you know, or knowing that you don't know, okay? So an example would be, you're in your exceptional learners book and you're reading, and you come across a word that you don't know, and you stop and you say to yourself, you know, this word is not familiar to me. I'm not sure what this word is. So your metacognition kicks in, and different strategies kick in, and you might skip that word and then read a few words after it to see if those words would give you a clue. Or you might back up a little bit and think about the possibilities, given the context of the sentence, what that word might mean. But the key is that you've stopped and you've recognized the fact that you don't know that word. Well, students who have disabilities oftentimes lack metacognition. In other words, they don't know that they don't know. And typically, students that have reading disabilities they'll see a word, they'll just sort of keep reading. They won't recognize the fact that they don't know the word, and they don't know the strategies to be able to go back and or they don't have the capacity or the capability to go back and slow down and to think about what that word might be, all right? So when we talk about, again, reading or any kind of disability, these short-term, long-term working memory, metacognition become really important. Now, Lexile, you can go ahead and look at that on your own, but Lexile is a tool that is used in many districts, and it's used to match the child's reading ability with the difficulty of a text. So if you know a child's reading disability, and you know, or I'm sorry, reading ability, and you know that they're reading at a 4th grade, let's say that we have a 5th grade student who's reading at a 3rd grade level. What the Lexile does is it tells us what books would be appropriate at the 3rd grade level for that particular student. So when students are going to the library or when a teacher is getting ready to instruct in a reading class, knowing the Lexile level of the student is very, very important. It's kind of like knowing your shoe size when you go in to get shoes. If you know your shoe size, then the shoe salesman can kind of match your shoe with your size. Lexile does the same thing, and I would encourage you to look at this little video which more clearly explains the use of Lexiles. Again, many school districts now use Lexile as a way of matching students' reading with their text. Locus of control, this will be something, I think we might have talked a little bit about it at the first part of the semester, but this is really it has to do with efficacy, the belief that a student can do something. And when we talk about locus of control, it can be internal or external. So if I'm a student and I have an internal locus of control, right, that means that if I've achieved something or I've done well on a test, then I attribute that success to me, to something that I've done, to a strategy that I've used. All right? And over and over and over again, if you continue to build up your internal locus of control, you develop that idea of self-efficacy, that you can do that you are worthy, that you are able to accomplish and be successful. Now, if I have an external locus of control, that means that I am attributing my ability to do something to external events or to things that are beyond myself. Okay? So for example, let's say for some reason I got an A on a spelling test, and a student with an external locus of control, if I said, well, how did you get that A? They would say something like, well, it was just lucky, or it was just my turn to get an A, or I really don't know how I did that. It was just like an accident. So that's a sign that a student has not really developed their self-efficacy, and that they attribute oftentimes their failures to other people. So when you have students that drop out of school or say, I can't do this, or this is boring, or this teacher's not meeting my needs, if you look beyond that, oftentimes it's problems with motivation, it's problems with how they see themselves. And there are a whole host of reasons why that might occur, especially in background situations. So when we refer back to Juanita Pope or Justin, there's a good idea or good chance that those students may have external as opposed to internal locus of control. Okay. Now there are some strategies that we can use to help students develop metacognition, to help them to slow down and kind of work on managing their disability. And those strategies, we'll cover them more deeply in this chapter, but one has to do with self-instruction. So having students slow down enough to ask themselves, what do I do? How can I solve this problem? How am I doing? Did I do it right? So all the kinds of things that you do, I would call that self-regulating behavior. You self-regulate. These are things that are really challenging for people with disabilities. Self-monitoring is another strategy that students with disabilities have to be trained in. having students keep track of their own behavior through self-evaluation and self-recording. Okay? Sometimes students have behavior problems and are not even aware that they have the behavior problems, but by teaching them to self-monitor their behavior or self-monitor their academic success, sometimes they can create greater awareness. Scaffolding is where the teacher provides assistance and then sort of fades out. So scaffolding, you kind of holding the person on the ladder, helping them go up and down the ladder, but at a point in time you kind of remove yourself from the situation, and hopefully the student will be able to go up the ladder successfully. And reciprocal teaching is giving the students the role of the teacher, and then the teacher becomes the student. So I know that you've heard that if you really want to know something really well, that assume the role of a teacher and teach it to someone else. Well, this is where that reciprocal teaching idea comes in mind. So those are 4 strategies that we'll explore a little bit further. Another strategy is direct instruction. Now, this is different than the direct instruction that we've talked about in our class, where you know, actually what we're doing right now is a form of what you've learned in EDUC 22204, direct instruction, where you're teaching to the whole class and you're kind of giving them the information. But direct instruction in terms of special needs or learning disabilities is a very highly structured teacher-directed method of instruction. The lessons that you teach are usually scripted. The curriculum is based on mastery learning. The pace is very rapid. Usually students are homogeneously grouped, and there are frequent progress monitoring assessments. Okay, so if you click on the YouTube click there, you'll get an idea of what a directed instruction looks like. Again, it's different than when we talk about cooperative, the 4 types: cooperative learning, direct instruction, mastery learning, problem-based learning. This type of direct instruction is different than those 4 categories. This is a very tight, very highly scripted type of method of instruction. And research says that students with disabilities learn best through this method. Assessments, we'll be talking about assessments in this chapter. Curriculum-based assessments, I think you know that. We talked about that in chapter 1, where we're taking samples from the curriculum, assessing students to see how they're doing based on the content or the work we're doing in class. Oftentimes fluency is what's targeted. An informal reading inventory is a very, very helpful tool. You'll learn about this with Dr. Carr and Dr. Jackson and other classes. But this is a tool where we select a passage from a book that a student might be reading in class. Usually pick about 100 or 200 words. We make a copy of the passage. We ask the students to read the passage, and then as a teacher, we're kind of marking down, we're keeping track of their time, their fluency, their rate, how long they're taking, and then we're keeping track of the errors that they're making in their reading. This is really helpful for us to determine whether a student can read a passage at the independent level, in other words, he needs no help, or at the instructional level, where the student is reading fairly successfully but needs help, or whether or not the student really has difficulty with that passage and is reading at the frustration level. And when that occurs, then teachers need to take a look to see if, perhaps take a look at the Lexile level to see if the reading material is too difficult, and some modifications might need to be made. Again, there's another link there that might be helpful to you. Some other strategies that we'll talk about would be repeated readings, where a student takes a passage, 100 words, and reads it over and over and over again. And as he or she does that, they become more fluent, the words become more natural, and the reading sounds more like talking. And some content enhancement, graphic organizers, mnemonics. These are all research-based strategies that really can help all students, but especially those with learning disabilities. Okay, so I hope that background in language helps you. We'll be covering most of those terms in this chapter. Chapter 6 is pretty dense in terms of content, but it's very, very interesting because many of the things that we'll talk about in chapter 6 will be things that you can actually use in a regular classroom with all students. Okay, what's it like to have a disability? There's a program called FAT City, and FAT stands for Frustration, Anxiety, and Tension. This is a wonderful clip. It's an older clip, but it's a wonderful clip that illustrates what a student with disabilities might go through in a regular class. Now, this clip will take a little while for you to view it, but I think it's very worthwhile for you to kind of put yourself in the place of that student with a disability. And I would strongly encourage you to watch this. We'll talk about this also in class. So one question is, explain what it's like to be normal. What does that mean? What does normal mean? We know that from Chapter 1, students with disabilities deviate to some extent from being normal. But we also know that that deviation is on a spectrum. It may just be not quite at grade level, or it might be a student that has severe disabilities. But I think that question is a good one to ask, good one to ponder, good one to reflect on. Is there such a thing called normal? This quote is an interesting quote. I can no more make you understand what it's like to be dyslexic than you can make me understand what it's like to be normal. So students with disabilities have a hard time explaining what it's like. Unless you have one, it's very difficult to explain what it's like to have a disability. And again, if we go back to FAT City, I think you can begin to understand what it might be like, or what a student with disabilities might feel like. All right, some misconceptions. We do this every chapter, and what I'd like you to do is just take a few minutes and kind of go through these, determine whether they're true or false. Feel free to stop the video now, and then I'm going to pick up where the answers are. Let's take a look at number one, question number one. IQ and the achievement discrepancy model, which we talked about in Chapter 2, is a straightforward, error-free way of determining whether a student has a learning disability. And you know from Chapter 2, that's false. The model falls short in terms of it's not reliable for young students. The discrepancy model, oftentimes if a student is in second or third grade and they don't meet the criteria, which is the difference between IQ and achievement, that what they used to do in the past is just say, well, wait a couple more years and then that gap will become wider by the time the student is in fourth or fifth grade, and then we'll qualify that student for special ed. So that's really not a good way to go, that wait and fail method. Response to intervention has been documented to be an error-free way of determining whether a student has learning disabilities. We know there's a lot of potential with RTI, but there's still research out that questions whether or not it's a viable source. Also, RTI, if you remember when we talked about it, that it's really important to use a lot of the pieces with fidelity, and teachers oftentimes, because of their busy schedule and all the things that they need to tend to, it's difficult to use or to make use of fidelity when they are involved in so many other things. 3, all students with learning disabilities are brain damaged. We know that's false. That used to be a belief back many, many years ago, but now we know that oftentimes disabilities have to do with some type of damage in the brain, in the neurotransmitters, left temporal lobe. The fact that many definitions of learning disabilities have been proposed is an indicator that the field is in chaos. Well, we know that in the 60s, when I started teaching, that pretty much could be true, that the field was very chaotic. But because of advances over the years in psychology, in medicine, in education and instruction, we now know that the field is much more organized than it was back in the 60s. The rapid increase in the prevalence of learning disabilities, number 5, is due in part to poor diagnostic practices. This could be true. The ability to be able to really identify students that have learning disabilities certainly is a factor, but we also know that that there are many other factors that increase the potential for students to have learning disabilities. So it could be cultural, it could be poverty. We also know that parents that have students that have intellectual disabilities would rather have them placed in learning disabilities because that label is less severe. And so we have many parents, or often parents will push towards an LD label rather than an intellectual disability label, which thus increases the number of students that would have learning disabilities. And number 6, few advances have been made in understanding the causes of learning disability, and that's false. Although we need to do a whole lot more, science and medicine, the study of the brain, all of those things have helped helpful in identification of the causation of learning disabilities. Math disabilities are relatively rare, number 7. We know that that's false. Math disabilities are very common. And students with learning disabilities have problems only in the academic areas. We also know, as I mentioned several times, that students that have difficulty in the learning disability area, oftentimes that carries over into social and emotional areas as well. That's why it's important to really, for classroom teachers to understand not only learning disabilities in the academic sense, but also to understand how it affects students emotionally and behaviorally. All right, so one question that I would ask is to go back and identify at least 3 misconceptions relating to learning disabilities. What's it like to have a disability? Now, we're not talking about a learning disability, but we're just talking about a common, well, not a common, but we're just talking about a disability by itself. This is a very interesting clip about a student who has a very unusual type of disability, and he has difficulty walking. So take a look at this, see if you can get some insights into this particular student's their understanding of themselves, how they see their disability, and so I think you'll enjoy this clip. Now, what's it like to have a learning disability? This is another clip that I think you'll enjoy. Again, we can talk about and learn all about the terms and understand the content, but as much as possible, I'm trying to put you in the place of a particular student who might have a learning disability. And this clip, I think, will help do that. We've mentioned briefly that the nature of disabilities in the past, it was very, very chaotic and diffusive. We had many, many contradictory terms when we were talking about students with disabilities, and those sorted terms, various terms, caused a lot of confusion in the field. But as the field has matured, probably over the last 40, 50 years, the field has grown in terms of identifying learning disabilities, has grown in the ability to identify causes, and also has grown in the ability to identify what approaches are best used. So we've seen a lot of growth in the field in terms of how to help students with disability ever since I've been in the profession in the early 1970s. How has the nature of learning disabilities field evolved? In other words, a little bit of a history lesson here. How has it moved from chaos to a more common knowledge base? Well, I have a name of a young person here called Samuel Kirk. I like to put the picture of Captain Kirk here because it helps students remember. But in 1963, I would have been probably about 12 years old, and Samuel Kirk was the first person to really use the term learning disabilities. And the term implies, this is a really important point, a term implies someone that has normal intelligence, okay? Again, normal is a interesting term, has many variables related to it, but someone who has normal or fairly normal intelligence but has trouble learning. Now again, that picture is not Samuel Kirk, that's Captain Kirk from the Enterprise, but I thought it might be a good way for you to remember. Now, prior to the time, 1963, when Samuel Kirk coined the phrase learning disabilities, there were several different terms that we used to use for people with learning disabilities. We used to call them minimally brain damaged, slow learners, dyslexic, perceptually disabled. And so whenever these terms were thrown around, it was really difficult to determine what did they actually mean, who did the terms apply to. And this slide kind of gives you, again, a historical look at what how some of the terms were used back prior to the mid-60s. We'll end this segment on this slide. There's a lot of print here, but I think it'd be very important for you to read it very carefully because it does capture the essence of what a learning disability is, a specific learning disability. It's a general term that refers to a heterogeneous, in other words, a variety of individuals, of disorders, manifest by significant difficulties in acquisition. Now, this is really important. So you can have learning disabilities and the ability to listen, the ability to speak, the ability to read, the ability to write, the ability to reason, or mathematical abilities. When we're working in the area of schools, public schools, oftentimes it's reading and math, but those are some other areas that you see that could be qualified as learning disabilities. These disorders are intrinsic to the individual, all right, and oftentimes they are due to a dysfunction of the central nervous system or the brain. And these students have trouble self-regulating their behavior. In other words, they have trouble tracking or knowing that they've made a mistake or knowing that their behaviors are out of line. They have problems with social perception. In other words, the ability to get a sense for how other people feel about them, and they have trouble with social interactions. All right? So one idea that you might want to use is draw a concept map to help you organize what this definition of disability means. Again, it's pretty inclusive. There's a lot of terminology here, but it really would be important for you to understand the scope of what the term disability means. And I'm going to stop here, and then we will pick up in the next module.